Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling cases in the history of Appalachia. We'll explore the events that rocked the Virginia highlands in 1921 today, when the tree's silence contained secrets that shouldn't have been revealed. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments if you're following along. Let's begin. The environment of the Virginia Appalachians has always been distinct. Mountains covered in thick mist, steep valleys hardly pierced by, sunshine and remote settlements that resembled time-lost islands. The Wise County area was approaching the coldest months in the fall of 1921. Any trip became a dangerous ordeal due to badly maintained dirt roads, particularly when the rains converted the roads into mud rivers. For survival, the families living in these hilly areas relied on coal mining, small-scale farming, and hunting. The legislation frequently came too late, if at all, and life was hard. In the area, Marybelle Carter was recognized as a woman of remarkable presence. She established a contentious reputation in the neighborhood surrounding Norton, a tiny hamlet tucked up in the foothills, by the time she was 32. Marybelle didn't meet the expectations placed on women at that time. Even the most conservative of them found her traveling alone, trading land, frequenting bars, and speaking directly to men unsettling. Her piercing eyes, her strong gait, and her dark hair, which was constantly pulled back in a tight bun, made her an impossible figure to disregard. She resided in a wooden cottage on a remote property on the highest mountains in the county, surrounded by old trees that served as a natural barrier to keep out intruders. Very few ever came. Those who ventured up there related bizarre tales of voices reverberating down the valley on windless nights, lights flickering in the windows in the early morning, and an unsettling sensation that enveloped anyone who approached too closely. Marybelle didn't often have guests, but when she traveled to the city to purchase supplies she was often the source of rumors when negotiating a transaction. In mid-October, the first indication that something was wrong appeared. A few miles from Marbelle's land, a farmer named Thomas Belmont told the local sheriff that he had noticed some unusual activity in the region. He claimed to have seen new horse and wagon tracks as he strolled along the path that led to her cabin, unusual for someone who had such a remote life. Additionally, Thomas reported a strong, disagreeable smell emanating from the direction of the property, an unidentifiable smell that made him queasy. Harold Pritchard, the sheriff, listened to the tale with suspicion. Since Marybelle had always been the subject of rumors and baseless charges, he didn't see the need to look into the matter further. However, the reports persisted. A troubling story was presented to the sheriff's office by a woman called Estelle Monroe a week later. She claimed that 3 weeks prior, her brother, Leonard Monroe, a traveling businessman, had visited Marbelle's property to offer her products and never come back. Every 10 days, Leonard would normally write to the family, but the stillness had lasted too long. Desperate, Estelle pleaded for someone to look into it. Still hesitant, Sheriff Pritchard said he would look into the matter but did not act right away. The matter didn't become more serious until a third report made it to the authorities. In a meadow close to Marbelle's, a team of hunters investigating the more isolated parts of the highlands discovered abandoned personal possessions. Property, a leather rucksack, a few kitchen tools, and papers proving the owner was Leonard Monroe were among the items. After bringing the artifacts to town, the hunters gave them to the sheriff. Harold Pritchard was unable to ignore it this time. After gathering 2 deputies, he made the decision to go to Marybelle Carter's cabin in order to learn the truth about what was actually happening in those shadowy mountains. It was a challenging climb. Every step was dangerous because the slope was steep and coated in wet leaves. The group felt like they were being followed every step of the way because the morning mist had not yet entirely cleared. There was no sound at all when they arrived at the property. There was only the chill wind rustling through the naked branches, No movement in the trees, no animal sounds. At first sight, the cabin appeared deserted, with the door locked and the windows closed. The sheriff announced his presence by knocking multiple times, but nobody replied. He chose to push his way in after a few minutes of waiting. Everyone there would never forget what they discovered inside that cabin. There was a tangible sense that something horrible had occurred there, and the initial hints were just the start of a revelation that would prove to be much deeper than anyone could have predicted. Everything inside the cabin was dark. The majority of the outside light was blocked by heavy curtains, and the men covered their noses with handkerchiefs due to the musty, indescribable smell in the air. Pritchard, the sheriff, lighted a lantern and started looking around the room. The initial impression was one of recent desertion. Someone had been there for a few hours, as evidenced by the dirty dishes piled in the sink, the clothes scattered across a wooden chair, and the heated ashes in the fireplace. Simple, weather-worn furnishings adorned the small main room. A table in the middle held strewn documents, some of which seemed like business transaction records, while others were just unintelligible notes. Some of these documents were picked up by the sheriff and examined them using the lantern's light. There were dates going back several months, amounts that indicated some sort of company, and the names of people he knew, locals. However, none of this clarified the bizarre rumors that were going around the location or the disappearance of Leonard Monroe. The sheriff was alerted to a door at the rear of the cabin by one of the deputies. It led to a cellar and was ajar. Pritchard's chest constricted. In remote mountain dwellings, cellars were frequently used for storage. Food in the cold, but there was a sense of peril about this specific entrance. Holding the lamp before him, he climbed down the wooden stairs that creaked under his weight. As he descended, the stench grew stronger, and the sight of the crowded dirt floor stopped him cold. The basement, a kind of underground room carved from the granite rock, was bigger than anticipated. The walls were lined with improvised shelves, but neither the anticipated food nor the tools were on them. Rather, there. There were wooden boxes sealed with rusty nails, glass jars filled with black substances, and obviously distinct personal belongings. Hats, purses, rings, pocket watches, and shoes in different sizes. It appeared as though someone was gathering the possessions of travelers. Pritchard summoned his deputies, and they all started mentally cataloging everything they had observed. A wallet holding Leonard Monroe's identifying documents was discovered among the items. Their worst fears were validated by the discovery. However, Leonard wasn't alone. 1. There were items that seemed to have belonged to 5 or 6 different people. Some of the names on documents discovered there were familiar to the sheriff. They were travelers and itinerant traders who had recently traveled through the region and had never been seen again, according to historical accounts. A diary was discovered by one of the workers beneath a stack of used textiles. Marybelle's notes, written in exquisite handwriting, were clearly visible on the yellowed pages. 3 years prior, in 1918, the earliest entries were made. She talked about her life in the mountains, her financial struggles, and her mounting resentment of the people who avoided and condemned her. The tone shifted as the pages turned. She started writing about opportunities, about the necessity to survive at any costs, and about people who were passing through the area but would be missed. The latest submissions were unsettling. Marybelle recounted interactions with tourists, apparently friendly discussions that ended suddenly. She recounted 2 men, one who gave tools and the other who had sold materials and ended up staying for dinner, and, because of the poor weather, chose to spend the night in the cabin. A third, who arranged the land acquisition, was never seen coming down the mountain again. The connotation was obvious, but the specifics were ambiguous. Making people vanish was the solution Marybelle had discovered to her financial issues. The magnitude of what they were discovering sent a shiver down the sheriff's spine. This was not a singular occurrence. The remote home in the mountains has turned into the setting for a sequence of incidents that the locals never thought would occur so near to their homes. Pritchard gave his deputies instructions to gather all papers and items that might be used as proof. Marybelle Carter has to be located and held accountable as quickly as possible. One of the assistants saw marks on the dirt floor of the cellar while they were working. Deep grooves appeared, as though a heavy object had been repeatedly pulled in the direction of a certain wall. When they looked more closely, they found that portion of the rock. A kind of concealed compartment had been created by removing and replacing the wall. They were able to move the stones with homemade equipment. Even the most seasoned men's stomachs churned at what they discovered behind them. The remnants of what Marybelle had kept concealed for years were there in that hidden room, etched into the mountain's very granite. It could no longer be denied. The evidence was frightening and indisputable. Sheriff Pritchard was aware that this case will alter Wise County's history forever, and that the details of this, in a way no one could have foreseen, the lone woman in the mountains would eventually come to light. The news went like wildfire over the mountains of Virginia. The entire Wise County area was aware within hours that Marybelle Carter's property had been the site of a horrific discovery. With every replay, rumors spread, and people congregated in town squares, churches, and taverns to talk about what had actually transpired in that remote cabin. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, Sheriff Pritchard dispatched messengers to nearby counties, asking for assistance in finding Marybelle, who had vanished into thin air. A group of detectives started recording everything they discovered on the property as the quest grew more intense. Every personal belonging was listed, every document was reviewed, and every detail was noted. Although laborious and slow, the work was essential. Among the items discovered were odorless letters from people who obviously wanted to see their loved ones again. A man named William Hodges wrote one in which he claimed to have made a nice deal with a woman in the mountains and would soon return home with sufficient funds to purchase seeds for the upcoming crop. The letter never made it to its intended recipient. Stories about the case started to appear in local publications. Even the most doubtful were taken aback by the front-page headline published in the leading newspaper in the area, the Norton Gazette. Unsettling findings in the Wise Mountains exposed sinister truths. While avoiding explicit specifics, the article carefully explained what had been discovered while emphasizing how severe the issue was. According to the paper, items discovered on the property had identified at least 6 individuals, all of whom had been through the region between 1918 and 1921. There was division in the community. Some thought Marybelle was a cold-blooded killer who had deceived unsuspecting tourists into stealing their possessions. But others recalled the struggles she had endured over the years. In 1916, Marybelle lost her husband in a coal mining accident, leaving her to manage the land on her own without any resources or assistance. The state of society, a widowed woman in the mountains had few options at the time. Some contended that her principles may have been tainted by loneliness and misery, transforming her into someone she never would have thought she would become. The hunt for Marybelle grew in the meanwhile. Teams of armed men searched the area's well-known valleys, caverns, and footpaths. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack to discover a single individual in the huge Appalachian landscape, which provided innumerable hiding places. The temperature was starting to decrease as late October drew near, worries mounted that Marybelle might not be able to withstand the alpine cold for very long, particularly if she were hurt or without sufficient supplies. Elijah Booker, a rancher, arrived at the sheriff's office with vital information on the 5th day of the search. He claimed to have seen a woman who fit Marybelle's description traveling south 2 days before to the cabin's discovery, following an old hunter's route that led to the Lee County boundary. According to Elijah, she was carrying a big backpack and seemed hurried, avoiding eye contact when he attempted to say hello. He hadn't given the incident much attention at the time, but now he saw how important the knowledge might be. Right away, Sheriff Pritchard planned a fresh expedition with a southern focus for the county. Elijah referenced a trail that was notoriously hazardous due to its numerous ravines and places where the ground could suddenly give way. It was also a less traveled trail, which made it perfect for someone trying to vanish. The group, armed and ready to take on the harsh terrain, they started out at dawn. Additional information regarding Marybelle's life started to surface as the hunt went on. Previously reluctant to talk about her, neighbors now volunteered their recollections and insights. Marybelle would frequently return to town after extended absences, according to a woman named Dorothy Simmons. On these occasions, she appeared to have enough money to purchase supplies in large quantities, which was at odds with the poor financial condition everyone was aware of. Another local, a businessman named. Over the years, Marybelle had attempted to sell Albert Raines a number of valuables, including rings and pocket watches that he now believed belonged to the victims, according to Raines. They were piecing together the story of Marybelle Carter. What surfaced was a picture of a lady who had stepped over a boundary that ought never to have been crossed. However, there were still a lot of unsolved questions. In what way did she persuade tourists to stay on her land? What took place in the mountains those nights? Above all, where was she now? The strain in the region was tangible. Early, families locked their doors. The remote locations were avoided by travelers, and everyone was on high alert because they thought Marybelle may be spying from somewhere. The matter had grown beyond a straightforward criminal probe. It had come to represent all that might go wrong when loneliness, hopelessness, and a lack of empathy collide in the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains. Conditions became more challenging as the group moved south into Wise County. Elijah Booker's journey. This became little more than a route for wildlife as it grew closer to the hillsides. Even in the middle of the day, there was a constant sense of darkness due to the tree's high canopy, which allowed very little sunlight to reach the ground. In order to prevent slipping or falling into the unexpectedly opening gorges along the path, the group had to move gently forward, evaluating each step. They discovered the first concrete sign on the third day of their hunt in that direction. A tiny, unlit bonfire that was still covered in new ashes showed that someone had set up camp there recently. There were footprints all about the scene that seemed to belong to a single individual, and the size of the markings was consistent with what would be anticipated of a lady. Sheriff Pritchard was both relieved and nervous. Although they were headed in the correct direction, Marybelle was traveling more quickly than they had expected, especially when transporting supplies and traversing dangerous terrain. Following the footsteps, the group reached Raven's Gorge, a deep gorge that was carved by a torrent that descended from the tallest mountains. The locals had a bad opinion of the place. There, it was reported that travelers vanished, either falling dead from the cliffs or getting lost in the thick fog that suddenly arrived. Additionally, the area's unique acoustics produced odd echoes that made sounds and voices grow uncomfortably. They discovered more proof there, on the creek's edge. Evidently left to dry, a woolen blanket was suspended from a low branch. In the vicinity, traces on. There was evidence of someone leaning on a rock on the ground. The group was told by the sheriff to divide up in order to cover more ground while still keeping eye contact. They didn't want anyone to become lost in that organic labyrinth of trees and rocks. Jesse Tate, a seasoned tracker, was one of the men who saw something the others had overlooked. Someone had apparently ascended toward a higher rock formation, based on scratch marks found on a nearby rock. Following the trail, Jesse carefully ascended for a few minutes. discovered a little cave's entrance that was concealed by plants. He summoned the others, and they all approached cautiously. Although the cave was just 5 or 6 meters deep, it provided shelter from the rain and wind. They discovered other evidence of recent habitation inside. Marybelle wasn't there, but there were food remnants, a half-empty water bottle, and a ripped piece of cloth that looked like it had been used as a bandage. Presumably aware that she was being followed, she had gone out once more. The sheriff was very interested in a little notebook left half-buried behind loose boulders deep in the cave. As soon as he opened it, he recognized the diary in the cabin's exquisite handwriting. They were obviously made during the escape, and they were recent entries. Marybelle talked of her overwhelming regret and her restless nights as the faces of people she had trusted returned to haunt her. She said the first time had been an accident, an argument that ended horribly, and that she had started it all just trying to survive. Every subsequent action seemed inevitable after that. The notebook's words betrayed a troubled mind. Marybelle noted that she knew the moment she crossed that boundary, the life she had known was over, and there was no turning back. She said she had contemplated surrendering, but she persisted out of fear of humiliation, public condemnation, and the gallows. In other sections, she attempted to defend her conduct by claiming that the tourists were merely strangers passing through, that no one would truly care about them, and that she had been disregarded and left behind by society. With a deep sigh, the sheriff shut the journal. Although the remarks did not absolve Marybelle of her behavior, they provided insight into how someone could come to that conclusion. Severe poverty, extreme loneliness, and a lack of social support. As a result of all of this, morale gradually declined until the unimaginable was feasible. Nevertheless, there were actual victims, people who had families and should have been given justice. The hunt went on with fresh resolve. According to the notebook entries, Marybelle may have had a sprained ankle that limited her range of motion. This was the reason she had taken many breaks to rest. Now that they had the upper hand, the group knew they would soon catch up with her. The landscape started to shift as they continued southward. Mountains with dense forests give way to more open spaces with less vegetation and exposed rock formations. It was more difficult to hide in, but it was easier to move around. With each mile she traveled, Marybelle's possibilities for escape dwindled and her exposure increased. They noticed activity in the distance as the sun started to drop. A solitary figure was evidently hobbling as it moved slowly down a rocky slope. Sheriff Pritchard verified it with his binoculars. Marybelle Carter was the one. They had finally located her after days of ceaseless searching. To stop her from leaving again, the group carefully positioned themselves around the spot. The last conflict was going to occur. Sheriff Pritchard gave his men a cautious advance signal. He didn't want to incite a desperate response that would lead to more tragedy. Marybelle was too preoccupied with navigating the rough ground with her damaged leg to notice the group's presence yet. The atmosphere for that last moment seemed almost unreal because of the lengthy shadows the orange dusk light made on the rocks. The sheriff called her name when they were finally close enough to be heard. Marybelle came to a halt. In her tracks, her whole body tensing up like a lightning strike. Slowly she turned, revealing her face to the males for the first time. Her sunken eyes revealed restless nights, and her face of despondency spoke volumes. It was marked with terrible tiredness. She made no attempt to flee. She didn't yell. As though she had been anticipating this moment for a very long time, she simply stood on the brink of the rocky ridge. Pritchard continued to go forward, maintaining his. His hands were on display to demonstrate his lack of violent intent. He informed her that families wanted answers, that there were things that needed to be clarified, and that she had to go back with them. With her eyes focused on the far horizon where the sun touched the mountains, Marybelle listened silently. When she did speak, it was weak and full of suppressed emotion. She claimed to have known there was no way out, and to have anticipated being apprehended as soon as she left the cabin. Marybelle clarified that she hadn't run away because she thought she could dodge justice, but because she needed time to come to terms with everything she had done and face the person she had become. She said that she had relived every interaction, every choice, and every opportunity to take a different course during those days, spent alone with her thoughts in the mountains. The sheriff inquired about the passengers and the actual events that had taken place in the cabin throughout the years. Marybelle took a long while to close her eyes before responding. The first time had been a real accident, she explained. In 1918, a businessman by the name of Richard Dawson had visited her property to offer tools. He agreed to stay for dinner because of the impending harsh weather after they spoke. The payment for certain items Marybelle had earlier bought but had been unable to pay for came up during the evening. The dispute grew more heated. Richard started acting aggressively, and something happened during the heated argument that completely altered the course of events. Marybelle was terrified following that initial event. She was aware that she would be hanged without trial if the truth were found. Reluctance. Given her already damaged reputation, society would not pardon a lady in her predicament. She buried her possessions, concealed all the evidence, and made an effort to seem as though nothing had occurred. However, something had broken inside of her. Once so distinct, the distinction between good and wrong now appeared hazy. Months later, Marybelle sensed a chance when another tourist arrived. This man had enough monies to get her through the winter, and she was in dire need of money. It was simple to rationalize. No one would be aware. A passing stranger wouldn't be missed by anyone. This marked the start of a pattern that would recur in the years that followed. It became more and more simple to rationalize, to suppress one's conscience, and to view these people as solutions to their problems, rather than as unique persons with families and lives. Marybelle talked about how lonely she felt in that remote cottage. She talked about how the nights dragged on forever, and how the mountain solitude started to feel like a huge boulder pressing down on her. Nobody was available, too. Talked to no one who gave a damn if she was dead or living. Like a plant, bitterness spread inside her, contaminating every emotion and thought. She started to regard everyone as enemies who had deserted her and to blame the outside world for her predicament. The weight of those confessions was evident in the sheriff's solemn look as he listened in silence. The other men said nothing, some clearly troubled by what Marybelle had said. She went on talking as though she needed to let go of all she had been suppressing for so long. He talked about the moments he had nearly surrendered. The times he had gone to town with the intention of telling the sheriff everything. But he had always changed his mind at the last minute because he was afraid of the repercussions. Marybelle felt as though the weight of her words had emptied her out when she was done speaking. In an act of total surrender, she extended her wrists to the sheriff. With a metallic click that reverberated over the quiet valley, Pritchard approached cautiously, put on the iron handcuffs, and locked them. The group started going back, traveling at a leisurely pace to accommodate Marybelle's injured leg. It took 2 full days to descend from the mountains. Marybelle stayed quiet the entire way, absorbed in her own thoughts. The streets of Norton were already crowded when they arrived. They were the first to learn of her capture, and hundreds of people flocked to see the horrific woman. While some yelled insults, others just stared in disbelieving silence. The sheriff had to battle his way through the throng. To transport her to the county prison, Marybelle was put in a solitary cell where she would stay until her trial. Her only world was now the tiny barred window and the chilly stone walls. She stared at her hands as she sat on the small bunk, hands that had cultivated the land, prepared food, and carried out deeds that now plagued her. The quiet of the mountains was not the same as the quiet of the cell. This was the quiet of a future that had vanished, of doors shutting, of finitude. The days after the arrest of Marybelle Carter were characterized by Wasik County's unparalleled unrest. Norton, a small town that typically had a calm and steady pace, rose to prominence in the area. With notebooks in hand, journalists from nearby counties started to arrive, eager to learn more about the case, which was already being referred to as the Appalachian Horror. Copies sold out in a matter of hours after the Norton Gazette published additional editions every day. People were curious as to how this had occurred so close to them, how someone who lives with them but in isolation could have long held such sinister secrets. Sheriff Pritchard assembled a team whose only goal was to look into every facet of Embelle's life and try to find every potential victim. The undertaking was enormous. Poor records were kept at the time, particularly in rural and mountainous regions where a large population lived without the necessary paperwork. It was particularly hard to follow traveling merchants. Due to their business, many of them were constantly relocating from town to town and county to county without a permanent residence. Chances. Their families, if any, frequently stopped communicating with them for extended periods of time without thinking it strange. The group started attempting to link each item to a particular person using the items they had discovered in the cabin. William Hodges, a Kentucky draper who vanished in 1919, was identified as the owner of the silver pocket watch bearing the initials WH. When Telegraph contacted the family, they verified that William had stated in his final letter that he intended to travel across the Virginia mountains before coming home. The letter that was discovered in Marble's possessions had never been sent. Leonard Monroe's sister recognized a plain wedding ring with the words, "To Leonard with eternal love," inscribed inside. She went to Norton to see the ring for herself, and she started crying as she clutched it in her shaking hands. She informed detectives that Leonard was a good man who helped those in need and that he probably offered Marybelle help without understanding the risk he was taking. Unaware that she was widowed, Leonard's wife now had to face the heartbreaking reality of her husband's fate. Every item had a backstory. Families who had been unaware of their loved one's destiny for years suffered more with each identification. A blacksmith from Tennessee identified a pair of exquisite leather boots as the same type he had created for his cousin, a hunter who vanished in 1920 while on a trip through the area. An itinerant preacher had owned a Bible with a name written on the cover. He preached in remote towns throughout the Appalachians. For months, his congregation in West Virginia prayed for his safe return, but they never thought he would come back. The county prosecutor, a tough guy named Theodore Blackwood, started getting the case ready for trial as the investigation went on. Blackwood was well known for his unyielding approach to crime and had openly declared that he would pursue the worst punishment possible for Embelle. He saw the case to be more than just an individual issue. Justice, but also as a chance to make a strong statement about the rule of law, even in the most rural and inaccessible places. He maintained that everyone was subject to the law, regardless of how challenging their individual circumstances may be. Because Marybelle lacked the funds to retain her own counsel, the court appointed a local lawyer, Samuel Garrett, to handle her defense. Middle-aged Garrett was well known for his empathy and conviction that everyone should have a fair defense, no matter how serious the case. Of the charges, in the weeks preceding the trial, he made multiple visits to Marybelle's cell in an attempt to come up with a plan that would at least spare her from the gallows. Garrett learned details about Marybelle's story that were previously unknown during these discussions. She told him about her challenging upbringing in a low-income mining family, how she had lost 3 brothers to disease and accidents when she was young, and how she had married a man at the age of 16 who had vowed to save her from that life of suffering. When her husband started drinking excessively, their once promising marriage fell apart. She was left alone and in debt after he passed away in a mining accident 5 years later. The years that followed were like a slow drowning, according to Marybelle. Prejudice against unmarried women in the mountain settlements made it more difficult for her to get employment, wash clothes, sew, and perform other tasks when they came up. Because they perceived her as weak, some males harassed her. She was shunned by other ladies because of her. Poses a risk to their marriages. Before she eventually relocated to that isolated cabin where she could at least live without the incessantly critical stares, she found herself pushed to the periphery of society and growing more and more alone. Although Garrett was aware that this terrible tale would not excuse Marybelle's behavior, he hoped it would shed some light on how someone could get to that position. He intended to contend that his client's judgment had been hampered by acute loneliness and debilitating poverty. That she wasn't a natural monster, but rather a person who had been shattered by unfeasible circumstances and who had consequently chosen awful choices. In the meantime, public interest was maintained by the press. Newspapers all throughout the area carried speculative articles, some of which portrayed Marybelle as a cunning monster and others as a victim of society who had turned into a tormentor. Dramatic drawings presented Marybelle as a mysterious person hunting gullible travelers, or showed the lonely mountain home surrounded by menacing fog. The reality, was always more nuanced than any of these oversimplified representations. As the trial date drew near, the relatives of the victim started to arrive in Norton. They desired to be there. They desired to gaze into the eyes of the woman who had abducted their loved ones. If there were any explanations at all, they wanted to hear them. When the local hotel was full, locals opened their houses to make room for the guests. Everyone in the town appeared to be waiting for the day when a reckoning would be made. Within, Marybelle spent her days in deep silence in her cell. She just ate what she needed to survive, refusing most meals. She occasionally wrote on scraps of paper that the sheriff gave her at her request. These notes were well guarded since they included thoughts on her life, the decisions she had made, and the regret that now overwhelmed her. She stated in one of her writings that having to live with herself after realizing what she had done was worse than the terror of dying. A priest from the area, Reverend Marcus Sullivan, started making frequent trips to Marybelle. He clarified he wasn't there to judge her, but rather to provide spiritual support if she so wished. The main reason Marybelle, who wasn't really religious, enjoyed the visits was because they were a respite from the oppressive routine of her cell. Even though he was aware that there was not much time for that, the Reverend made an effort to steer her in the direction of sincere remorse and the pursuit of some kind of redemption throughout their talks. The court established. The trial was scheduled to begin the first week of December 1921. Although the courtroom was set up to hold as many people as possible, everyone was aware that it would not be enough. There were just a few dozen seats available, despite hundreds of people wanting to go. The case was presided over by Judge Harold Morrison, who was renowned for his fairness and seriousness. He had stated unequivocally that he would not put up with emotional outbursts or chaos during the hearings. Tension in the city increased as the day drew near. Discussions. The same motif ran across the streets, stores, and places of worship. What had changed Marybelle Carter? Could a person's morality be so thoroughly tainted by loneliness and hopelessness? Or did she possess a darker side that had always existed and was just waiting for the proper circumstances to arise? There were no simple solutions to these problems, and maybe never would be. The case had turned into a reflection of the community's own shortcomings. How often had they disregarded a person in need? How often had they made judgments without knowing? How many people struggled alone against insurmountable odds while living in isolation in the mountains? It was impossible to deny the tragedy of Marybelle's actions, but it was also impossible to divorce them entirely from the circumstances surrounding them. Norton was covered with gray and cold on the morning of the trial. The streets were covered in a thick fog. and the air was heavy with the pervasive humidity of Appalachian winters. Individuals started swarming the courthouse before daybreak, fighting for the few seats in the gallery. Those who couldn't get inside waited outside for news that would undoubtedly be brought in by messengers all day long. Under strict guard, Marybelle was escorted from her cell to the courthouse. Her hair was pulled back in its customary tight bun. She was dressed simply in a dark dress that someone had donated, and despite her weariness, she had a rather dignified expression in her eyes. A profound stillness descended across the courtroom as she entered. Hundreds of eyes stared upon her, some with morbid interest, some with malice, and some with something that may have been compassion. Judge Morrison used well-chosen remarks to begin the hearing. He stressed that he expected complete decorum from everyone in attendance, and that this was a court of justice, not a public show. Any disruption would be met with instant dismissal from the courtroom. With a voice that echoed through the room with authority and restrained outrage, Prosecutor Theodore Blackwood stood up to make the charge. Blackwood started by summarizing what was known. He talked about the finding of the cabin, the identification of at least 6 people's possessions, and the diary entries that implicated Marybelle. Sheriff Pritchard, one of the witnesses he called who had taken part in the initial investigation, gave a detailed account of what had been discovered in that mountain dungeon. He was cautious in his portrayal, avoiding particularly upsetting details while still conveying the gravity of what had transpired. The victims' testimonies from families were requested. With her eyes swollen from crying, Leonard Monroe's sister testified. She talked about her brother's generosity, how he was always willing to lend a hand to strangers, and how his wife and 2 girls had waited for him for weeks on end before giving up. As she spoke, her voice broke frequently, and several people in the gallery had to covertly wipe away tears. Martha, the thin-looking wife of William Hodges, testified about the years of confusion she had experienced, and how she had persisted in thinking her husband was still alive someplace, only unable to come back for some reason. She claimed that learning the truth had been both a relief and a torment. Now that she was aware of what had occurred, at least, the ache was nearly intolerable. As she talked, she stared at Marybelle, hoping for some response, any indication of sincere regret. The Tennessee hunter's cousin mentioned a man who loved the mountains, who were familiar with all the local trails and caverns, and who, under the conditions outlined, would never have become lost. When his relative vanished, he was among many who didn't think it was just an accident. The fact that his suspicions were confirmed now left him feeling deeply unhappy that he had been correct, rather than satisfied. Samuel Garrett stood respectfully but resolutely when it was the defense's time. He made no effort to refute the facts presented by the prosecution. It would have been. In the face of overwhelming evidence, it would be impossible and dishonest to do so. Rather, he concentrated on creating a full picture of Marybelle Carter as a person rather than merely a criminal. He called on others who had known her prior to the incidents and could attest to the struggles she endured. Reluctant yet motivated by conscience, a former neighbor stood up to speak. She explained how, without demanding anything in return, Marybelle had provided food and folk cures to her family when her husband became ill. She talked about how lonely. It was evident in Marybelle's eyes that the woman appeared to be falling into a pitch-black abyss from which she was unable to rise. Although the witness made it apparent that this did not excuse Marybelle's subsequent behavior, it did provide background information about her prior behavior. In his testimony, Reverend Sullivan described his discussions with Marybelle in her cell. He talked about the sincere regret he had seen and how she would spend whole nights lying awake, haunted by nightmares in which her faces. She was tormented by victims. Knowing that he couldn't seem to be defending the indefensible, the Reverend was cautious in his remarks, but he thought it was crucial that the court see that there was true regret there rather than only a fear of the repercussions. Then Garrett did something out of the ordinary. Marybelle was summoned to testify on her own behalf. The courtroom was filled with a murmur. The prosecutor raised an objection right away, claiming that this was extremely irregular and might harm the defendant. Morrison, judge. Marybelle thought about it for a long time before agreeing, provided that she was aware that anything she said could be used against her. Marybelle took deliberate strides to the witness stand. With a low but firm voice, she put her hand on the Bible and vowed to tell the truth. Garrett started off by asking basic questions about her life to set the scene, which had already been somewhat explained. Marybelle gave a straightforward response, describing the details of her challenging life without attempting to arouse undue sympathy. When? Marybelle inhaled deeply before responding to Garrett's question on the particular incidents. She acknowledged that there was no evading or denying the fact that she had been the cause of the disappearances. Each incident started differently, but they all followed the same pattern, she recounted, her voice growing more and more emotional. Her property would be visited by tourists. She would extend simple hospitality, and eventually the occasion would arise. She discussed her initial thoughts about Richard Dawson and the altercation that turned combative. She acknowledged that she had made choices that would affect everything that followed in the fear that followed the altercation. The decision to shield herself rather than face the repercussions. The decision to conceal rather than report. Every decision after that got simpler. Until she could no longer identify the person she had become, the moral line became hazy. Marybelle glanced toward the family of the victims who were sat in the front row. She broke down in tears as she addressed them straight. She claimed that no apology would be sufficient to make up for the suffering she had caused, and that no words could make up for what she had done. Her victims, she admitted, were actual individuals with families who waited for them and loved them. She acknowledged that she had attempted to dehumanize them in her mind for a long time in order to justify her acts, but that she could now clearly see the horror of what she had done. Prosecutor Blackwood was unrelenting when he had the opportunity to cross-examine her. He made Marybelle face inconsistencies in her testimony and acknowledged that she had multiple chances to halt but had decided to go on. He wondered if her tears were for her victims or for herself. If her remorse was sincere or just a fear of the gallows. Marybelle candidly said that it was most likely both, that she was unable to distinguish between fear of her own destiny and regret for what she had done. After the hours-long grilling, Marybelle glanced, worn out, as though every word had taken more of her vitality. With her shoulders slumped beneath the weight of her public admission, she went back to her seat next to Garrett. There was silence in the room. Everyone was taking in what they had seen. The following day, closing arguments started. Blackwood made a compelling argument for the maximum punishment, claiming that any clemency would be a betrayal of the memories of the deceased, that society needed justice, and that the victims deserved justice. He recognized Marbelle's struggles, had encountered but maintained that many others endured comparable or worse circumstances without turning to evil. Garrett did not request acquittal during his final defense. He was aware that it would not be feasible. Rather, he pleaded for forgiveness, acknowledging that Marybelle was a human being who had done horrible things, but was also a result of the conditions society had helped to create. He maintained that the death sentence would not make the victims return or ease the suffering of the family, and that perhaps there would be greater justice if Marybelle will be burdened for the rest of her life by the consequences of her deeds. The waiting started when the jury withdrew to deliberate. The jury spent 3 whole days deliberating. Norton appeared to hold its breath throughout that period. People congregated in churches, taverns, and the streets to speculate about the outcome. Some contended that guilt had been established beyond a reasonable doubt. Others argued over the proper punishment, splitting between those who advocated for the gallows and the small number who stated that a life sentence would be an adequate penalty. During the wait, the relatives of the victims stayed in Norton. Because they were grieving together, they created a sort of transient community. They consoled one another, shared memories, and talked about their departed loved ones. After hours of conversation, Martha Hodges and Leonard Monroe's sister learned that their husbands had been surprisingly similar kind and trustworthy qualities that paradoxically left them vulnerable. This relationship between. One of the few things that came out of all that darkness was strangers brought together by tragedy. The jurors had to make choices inside the deliberation room that would affect them for the rest of their lives. 12 county men, selected on the basis of their purported objectivity, now had to decide not only whether a woman was guilty or not, but also what would happen to her in the end. Many of them knew the woman at least by sight. The debates were heated. Some jurors contended that the law was unambiguous and that feelings shouldn't get in the way of the administration of justice. Others grappled with more profound issues of free will, moral responsibility, and the factors influencing human decision-making. Benjamin Winters, a farmer who served on the jury, described the internal conflict that many of them experienced. He was familiar with the depressing loneliness of the Highlands, having lost his own wife a few years prior. He had a rough idea of how someone could start to descend into darkness. However, he then considered the victims, the travelers who were only looking for a secure place to stay, and discovered death instead. How can we strike a balance between justice and understanding? How do we balance current atrocities with suffering from the past? Marybelle stayed in her cell, away from the chaos around her as the jury deliberated. She had given up writing and was only sitting on the slender bunk, gazing at the stone walls. Every day, Reverend Sullivan paid her a visit and offered words of consolation and prayer, though he wasn't sure if they got through. Marybelle appeared to be in an inner realm where she was able to transcend human language, faced the ghosts that plagued her by herself. A messenger, carrying the word that the jury had returned a verdict, hurried out of the courthouse on the afternoon of the third day. Word got around fast, and a crowd had formed in a matter of minutes. Sheriff Pritchard and 2 officers escorted Marybelle back into the courtroom. Her attention was concentrated on a far-off object that only she could see, and she moved as if in a trance, her movements robotic. Judge Morrison went back to his raised chair, his face gloomy and exhausted. None of the jurors turned to face Marybelle as they filed in, which many saw as a warning sign. When asked, David Hutchinson, a well-known businessman and jury foreman, stood. The rustle of his clothes seemed loud since the room was so completely silent. Morrison inquired as to whether the jury had rendered a decision. According to Hutchinson, it had. He strongly stated that the verdict on the murder charges was unanimous when questioned about it. "I'm guilty of everything." There was a collective gasp in the room. Few, however, were truly taken aback. Marybelle remained seated with the same aloof look, showing no signs of reaction. After a pause, the judge proceeded to the sentencing stage. In his closing remarks, Prosecutor Blackwood stood and reiterated that, considering the seriousness and recurring nature of the offenses, no sentence less than the maximum would be suitable. He advocated for the victims who were unable to speak for themselves and for a community that need defense against those who decided to disregard civic and moral laws. Samuel Garrett made one last request for pardon, carrying out his duty to the very end. He did not try to portray Marybelle as innocent or downplay the crimes. Rather, he urged the judge to take into account the entirety of the circumstances, acknowledge that punishment did not always entail execution, and acknowledge that there were alternative forms of justice that would enable Marybelle to bear the consequences of her actions while still being held accountable to society. Morrison, Judge. His hands clasped on the table before him, he listened silently to both sides. He asked Marybelle to stand when it was time to say the sentence. Leaning on the table before her, she did so slowly. Morrison started out by discussing the gravity of the murders, the terrible effects on the victims' families, and the necessity for society to respect the law. Then, following what felt like an eternity of silence, he said, "Death by hanging, to be executed within 60 days." There was a mixed response in the room. While some hung their heads in solemn contemplation, others nodded in agreement. Families of the victims responded in different ways. While some felt that justice had been done, others just felt empty because they knew that no penalty would actually bring their loved ones back. Marybelle seemed to be unaffected by the sentencing, as though she had known what would happen as soon as she was apprehended. They returned her to the cell, where she would now live out her last days. Being aware of the deadline altered the character of her wait. Only the inescapable countdown to a predestined end remained, and there was no longer any question about the future. In an effort to assist Marybelle accept her situation and, if at all possible, achieve some kind of spiritual salvation before the end, Reverend Sullivan increased the frequency of his visits. Over the following few weeks, an unforeseen event occurred. Marybelle started talking to the Reverend more candidly about her life, including the crimes and everything that came before them. She shared tales from her early years, recollections of joyful moments before life turned intolerable. She talked about her childhood dreams, the person she had aspired to be, and how each of those dreams had been methodically dashed by reality. She also started writing again, but this time her writings weren't about regret and remorse. They were letters to her victims' families. She tried to provide some closure in each, some information about her loved ones' last moments that would provide a glimmer of hope. She made no effort to. Knowing that words would not be sufficient, I apologized and gave each family the whole truth, letting them make their own decisions. Some families didn't want anything from the woman who had ruined their life, therefore they didn't accept the letters. Others, seeing no use for them, read them and then set them on fire. Some, like Martha Hodges, however, took care to preserve the letters. Even though it was unpleasant, Martha informed the Reverend that it was preferable to know exactly what had happened to William than to live in constant uncertainty. Even though it was dark, knowledge at least ended years of agonizing ambiguity. The atmosphere in Norton gradually reverted to normal as the days went by and the execution date drew near. Journalists go out to find more tales. The town's regular routine continued as the families of the victims went back to try to restore their lives. However, something was irreversibly altered: the innocence of the group. The notion that this type of evil only happened in distant locations had been broken. Various people had various perspectives on the nearby mountains, observing both the gloomy mysteries that may be concealed in their shadows as well as the beauty of nature. Marybelle pondered in silence during her last days. Without objecting, without filing an appeal, without making any last-ditch efforts to avoid the inevitable, she accepted her sentence. According to Reverend Sullivan, she appeared to have discovered a sort of resigned peace, not joy or forgiveness, but a readiness to face what lay ahead. She informed him that maybe death was a blessing, a liberation not only from the outside world, but also from herself and her new identity. The Virginia mountains saw an especially severe cold spell in the last days of January 1922. The Appalachian foothills were blanketed in snow, a snowy blanket that stifled all sound. Every morning, Norton awoke to a dismal sky that appeared to mirror the ominous burden looming over the community. Few acknowledged experiencing a mixture of excitement and apprehension as the execution date drew closer and closer. The public, Executions were popular events of the time, with some viewing them as a necessary form of justice and others as a macabre kind of amusement. However, Sheriff Pritchard made the decision that this specific execution would be carried out in a different manner. He had seen executions turned into spectacles complete with gamblers, peddlers, and actions that, in his opinion, were demeaning to both the victims and the gravity of justice. He decided that there would only be a few official witnesses. Along with the Marybelle spent her last weeks in a nearly monastic lifestyle, even though the victims' families wanted to come. Even in the chilly darkness of her windowless cell, she would awaken before sunrise. Reverend Sullivan had urged Mary to discover inner peace by encouraging her to spend hours in private prayer. She spent much of her time writing and only ate what she needed to keep alive. She started composing letters to her folks as well as anything that seemed like a complete confession, a thorough account of everything that had transpired throughout those awful years. In order for future generations to properly comprehend what had transpired, the document was meant for the county archives rather than the general public. Marybelle described each victim separately, including how each interaction transpired and the precise times when she made decisions that affected the result. She was completely honest, admitting the lies she had told herself, the justifications she had employed, and the slow erosion of her moral compass. The candor with which she detailed her own psychological development was one of the most unsettling aspects of her written confessions. She described how she had been waiting to be found for weeks following the initial incident with Richard Dawson, unable to sleep and leaping at every sound. However, something changed in her when nobody showed there and things went on as usual. The shame persisted, but it was progressively replaced by a dissociative state. She started to perceive her behavior as apart from who she was, as though her genuine self only watched helplessly as someone else carried out those actions. Every following crime was made easier by this detachment. While a calculating portion of her mind was already making plans, Marybelle explained how she could be friendly to travelers, offering them tea and chat. She admitted that this provided a window into how someone might live with such stark inconsistencies, but it did not release her from accountability because she continued to make deliberate decisions at every turn. While she was the only but courteous hostess of the day, she changed completely at night. Marybelle and Reverend Sullivan talked about these writings for several hours. He read something that both deeply troubled him and fascinated him in an uneasy way. This was a first-hand story of how morality could be undermined by loneliness, despair, and a series of poor decisions until the original person was virtually gone. He battled between his pastoral obligation to provide, consolation, and his own moral disgust at what she had to say. One of the final things Marybelle said to Sullivan was something he would remember for the rest of his life. She claimed that the realization of how simple it had been to cross those boundaries was the most terrifying aspect of her entire experience, not the fear of dying or even the guilt of her crimes. He maintained that she wasn't a born monster, but rather a regular person who faced harsh situations and made awful options. And if that applied to her, it might apply to everyone. Everybody had the potential for both good and evil, and the situation dictated which side would show up. Those who heard this concept were extremely unsettled because it made them face difficult realities. It was simpler to view Marybelle as essentially unique, as someone whose behavior was beyond the comprehension of the average person. However, she implied in her own words that there was less of a gap between normalcy and monster, more than anyone wanted to acknowledge. This complicated the straightforward story of good versus evil that many favored, but it did not absolve her. Families of the victims responded to these events in different ways. Understanding Marybelle's perspective was useful to others, such as Martha Hodges, who felt it helped explain the inexplicable. Others thought it was really more manipulation, a last-ditch effort to win sympathy where none was due. The sister of Leonard Monroe vehemently refused to read anything. In her letter, Marybelle argued that nothing she said could alter the fact that her family had been destroyed and her brother had died. Sheriff Pritchard started making the required arrangements as the execution date drew near. 3 days early, the executionera man from a nearby county, who did the work expertly, arrived to check the tools and conduct the required calculations using Marybelle's weight and height. Even though he carried out the task with calm, professional competence, he acknowledged that killing a woman always made him feel more uneasy than putting men to death, a feeling he was unable to articulate. Marybelle spent her final night in almost total vigil. For the most part, Reverend Sullivan stayed with her, reading Bible passages and praying. Marybelle stayed composed, more so than Sullivan had anticipated. She assured him that she was prepared, that she had endured enough consequences for her deeds, and that maybe she would find the calm that had eluded her throughout her life on the other side. She was not deluded. She acknowledged that she was worried about divine forgiveness, but at the very least, she wanted to put an end to her conscience's ongoing suffering. She asked the Reverend one last thing. She requested that her works be kept alive after her passing, not as a morbid curiosity but as a warning. She wanted the next generation to comprehend the devastating effects of profound solitude, where previously there were only humans fighting for survival. The lack of compassion and community might give rise to monsters, if her tale may simply make one person appear more compassionately upon a distressed person, then maybe all that horror would have some redeeming significance. Although he wasn't certain the writings would be accepted as she hoped, Sullivan assured her that he would try his best to comply with her request. Instead of being a moral lesson, they were more likely to turn sensationalist and fuel the public's morbid curiosity. Nevertheless, he gave her this meager consolation in her last hours. As daylight broke and the day of execution came, Marybelle sat on her bunk, her eyes closed in deep prayer or concentration, her hands clasped in her lap. Despite barely getting a few hours of sleep during the night, she didn't appear tired. She appeared to have already partially detached herself from the material world, preparing herself for what lay ahead, as evidenced by the odd calmness in her demeanor. At dawn, Sheriff Pritchard reached the cell. As was traditional, he gave Marybelle one more supper, but she graciously declined, claiming she was not hungry. All she requested was a glass of water, which she took a slow sip while the sheriff described what would happen in the next few minutes. She paid attention without interjecting, occasionally nodding to indicate that she understood. The back courtyard of the courthouse had been set up overnight. A straightforward but sturdy wooden framework had been put up, carefully tested to make sure it would serve its purpose well. The executioner had completed his last computations, fine-tuning each element with the accuracy of someone who recognized that errors in this task created needless pain. As if nature itself understood the significance of the moment, the scene was illuminated by a diffuse, heatless light as the sky continued to be cloudy. Just before 8 a.m., witnesses started to arrive. Sheriff Pritchard concluded that the overall number of individuals was less than 20. Martha Hodges and Leonard Monroe's sister were among them. They were both dressed in black and had drawn, pale faces. Judge Morrison was there as part of his official duties, as was Prosecutor Blackwood. A few reporters from local publications have been admitted with the specific requirement that their reporting be done with decorum. Also present was Reverend Sullivan, who had assured Marybelle that he would stay until the very end. The sheriff and 2 officers led Marybelle out of the main building. Even with the light shackles around her ankles, she walked steadily. For the first time in her memory, her hair was down, cascading over her shoulders in dark waves, and she was dressed in the same dark dress she had worn during the trial. Something was almost dignified in her stance, a calm acceptance that stood in stark contrast to the fear that many anticipated. She paused at the base of the building and turned to face the group of witnesses. For a minute, she looked directly into Martha Hodges' eyes, and a silent exchange of words occurred between them that maybe only they both knew. Marybelle then turned to face Sheriff Pritchard, showing that she was prepared with a small nod. If she had any last remarks, the sheriff asked. Would like to express. Marybelle inhaled deeply before speaking, and in the crisp morning air, her voice was shockingly clear and powerful. She claimed that because she knew there would be no pardon for what she had done, she didn't ask for it. She admitted that no excuse or explanation could change the fact that her actions had caused incalculable suffering to innocent people. She hoped that her narrative would serve as a cautionary tale about the perils of extreme solitude and the lack of empathy in society. But she didn't attempt to justify her decisions with it. Speaking directly to the families in attendance, Marybelle declared that it was both acceptable and proper for her to take the faces of her victims with her wherever she went after death. Although she wasn't sure she deserved the spiritual consolation, she thanked Reverend Sullivan for his efforts. She added that she had once loved these regions before they became silent witnesses to her misdeeds, as she finally turned to face the far-off mountains that could be seen beyond the town's structures. Then her voice started to. She just stated she was ready, crack. The executioner guided Marybelle into the right posture while maintaining a professional demeanor. A final prayer was offered by Reverend Sullivan, who spoke quickly and softly, pleading for God's mercy for a soul in agony. Marybelle closed her eyes and made a silent movement with her lips, either repeating the prayer or just bidding farewell to a world she had never really comprehended or been comprehended by. The procedure was completed swiftly and effectively. There was no needless drama, no extension of the pain. It was all over in a matter of minutes when the executioner completed his task with the icy professionalism of a professional. Marybelle Carter was gone. She had spent 33 years in those mountains, experienced loneliness and sorrow, love and loss, violated dreadful boundaries, and devastated innocent lives. Her body was given to the county to be buried in an unmarked section of the neighborhood cemetery, where it would be forgotten without a headstone or memorial. Slowly, the witnesses scattered, each with their own ideas and emotions on what they had seen. Trying to decide whether she felt any sense of justice or closure, Martha Hodges stayed longer than the others, gazing at the now empty chamber. As she eventually left, she came to the conclusion that maybe this type of loss could never be truly resolved, simply the necessity to move on while carrying the absence like an unhealing wound. Over the next few days and weeks, Norton progressively resumed its regular schedule. Journalists went on to new stories after publishing their last articles. The families of the victims went back to their lives, altered irrevocably, but resolved not to allow the tragedy to fully define them. The location where so many atrocities took place was finally physically destroyed when the county ordered the mountain cabin to be torched. As if bearing the final tangible remnants of that sinister past, smoke billowed up the snow-covered mountains and vanished into the bleak sky. As promised, Reverend Sullivan preserved Marybelle's writings, placing them with precise instructions on their educational aim in the county archives. Throughout the years, academics would periodically study them in an effort to comprehend the psychology underlying the incidents, discussing issues of moral responsibility and exaggerating the situation. However, Marybelle Carter gradually faded into the background of Norton and the surrounding area, a name that most people would prefer to forget, a dark legend of the mountains, and a whispered narrative. The Appalachian Mountains persisted forever, and stoic their vast valleys and thick forests concealing innumerable mysteries. As always, life continued to move across those grounds, with new families living on the slopes, new travelers using the trails, and fresh chapters being written in the lengthy and intricate history of the area. However, people who were aware of Marble Carter's tale never again had the same perspective on those mountains. That tragedy had a harsh lesson that many chose to overlook, but that was still applicable. In addition to being about a lady who did horrible acts, Marybelle's story also told of a culture that let someone slip through all the barriers that kept people apart and alienated them until mankind started to break apart. Although it did not justify her behavior, it provided background on how evil could arise not from natural monsters, but rather from regular individuals who have been shattered by harsh situations and a series of bad decisions. More than a century later, tourists who still traverse those slopes hardly understand the events that took place there in 1921. The trails have been updated. Transportation and communication have been revolutionized by technology. Furthermore, the world has altered in ways that were nearly unthinkable to those individuals. However, human nature is essentially unchanged, with the potential for both love and cruelty, compassion and apathy, redemption and fall. A sobering reminder that evil seldom manifests itself in overtly dramatic ways is provided by the tale of Marybelle Carter and the lives she harmed. It frequently grows slowly in the dark, driven by loneliness, hopelessness, and the slow deterioration of moral values. It also acts as a warning on the value of compassion, community, and keeping people from sinking to the periphery of society, where they can be totally consumed by darkness. As mute and unmoving witnesses to generations of human lives with all its intricacies, tragedies, and secrets, the Virginia mountains hold this story, as they do many others. Additionally, on winter evenings when the valleys are covered with mist, it is easy to assume that those mountains still remember, that the echoes of those far-off events still reverberate in their depths, a whispered remembrance of a time when darkness triumphed over civilization, as the wind screams through the old trees. Please share your thoughts in the comments section if you have followed us through one of the most unsettling periods in Appalachian history. Despite their darkness, these tales highlight the frailty of the human condition and the significance of never allowing loneliness and hopelessness to overwhelm everyone around us. For more tales delving into the buried tragedies and secrets of history, subscribe to the channel. Additionally, press the bell to ensure you don't miss any episodes. Until the subsequent voyage through the darkness of the Sem.